Marcus had always been the type of man who responded immediately to text messages, who made himself perpetually available, who bent his schedule around the whims of women who caught his interest. At 32, he had accumulated a considerable collection of failed relationships and unrequited attractions, each following the same predictable pattern: initial interest, eager pursuit, overwhelming availability, and inevitable rejection or disinterest. It was only when he encountered the writings of Niccolo Machiavelli, not in the context of political power, but through the lens of personal relationships, that he began to understand the fundamental error in his approach to attraction and human nature itself. The revelation came not through the prince, but through a deeper understanding of Machiavellian psychology applied to the intricate dance of human desire. Machiavelli understood that power dynamics govern not just political relationships, but all human interactions, including the delicate mechanisms of romantic attraction. The core insight that would transform Marcus's understanding was deceptively simple. That which is easily obtained is seldom valued, and that which withdraws creates a vacuum that human nature compulsively seeks to fill. Sarah had been texting Marcus with increasing frequency over the past month. Their conversations had become a daily ritual, filled with playful banter and subtle flirtation. She would send him photos of her coffee, updates about her day, complaints about work, and late-night messages that seemed to invite deeper connection. Marcus, following his established pattern, responded to each message within minutes, offered solutions to her problems, provided constant validation, and made it clear through his immediate availability that she was his priority. The shift began subtly. Sarah's responses grew shorter, less frequent, more perfunctory. The playful tone diminished, replaced by polite but distant acknowledgements. The late-night messages stopped entirely. Marcus, sensing the familiar pattern of declining interest, made the mistake he had made countless times before. He increased his efforts. He sent longer messages, asked more questions, shared more personal details, and made his interest increasingly explicit. The result was as predictable as it was painful. Sarah's responses became even more sparse until they stopped altogether. It was during this period of reflection on yet another failed connection that Marcus encountered a passage from Machiavelli that would fundamentally alter his understanding. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. The words struck him with particular force because they highlighted the central error in his approach. He had been showing too much, revealing too readily, making himself too accessible, and therefore too predictable. The Machiavellian insight into attraction operates on the principle that human psychology is driven by scarcity, mystery, and the need to conquest what appears unattainable. When Marcus made himself constantly available, when he responded immediately to every communication, when he bent his schedule to accommodate Sarah's needs, he was unknowingly signaling low value and desperate availability. In the complex calculus of attraction, such behavior registers not as kindness or devotion, but as weakness and lack of options. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon runs deeper than simple game-playing or manipulation. It touches on fundamental aspects of human nature that Machiavelli understood centuries before modern psychology would provide scientific validation. The human mind assigns value based on scarcity and effort required for acquisition. That which is freely given is often taken for granted, while that which must be earned or pursued becomes inherently more valuable. When Marcus began to understand this principle, he realized that his approach to relationships had been fundamentally backwards. He had been operating from a position of abundance in giving, offering immediate responses, constant availability, eager solutions to problems, while simultaneously signaling scarcity in his own options and value. The more he gave freely, the less valuable he became in the eyes of those he pursued. The concept of destroying the weak self, as referenced in the title, begins with this recognition of one's own patterns of desperate availability and validation-seeking behavior. Marcus's weak self was the version of him that feared losing connection so intensely that he would sacrifice his own dignity, time, and priorities to maintain it. This weak self operated from a scarcity mindset that assumed any potential romantic connection was rare and precious and therefore worth any sacrifice to maintain. 3 weeks after Sarah had stopped responding to his messages, Marcus encountered her at a mutual friend's gathering. His instinct was to approach her immediately, to try to restart their conversation, to ask why she had stopped responding. Instead, he applied his newfound understanding of Machiavellian psychology. He acknowledged her presence with a brief nod, engaged in animated conversation with others, and demonstrated through his behavior that her lack of response had not affected his social confidence or general well-being. The transformation in Sarah's behavior was almost immediate and entirely predictable to anyone who understands the psychology of desire. She began approaching him, initiating conversation, asking about his recent activities, and showing clear signs of renewed interest. When she asked why he hadn't been texting her, Marcus responded with calm honesty. "I figured you weren't interested in continuing our conversations." The simplicity of this response, delivered without accusation or neediness, communicated several powerful messages. That he had options, that he respected her autonomy, and that he was not emotionally dependent on her attention. This encounter illustrates the first major component of Machiavellian attraction psychology: the power of strategic withdrawal. When Marcus stopped chasing, when he stopped making himself immediately available, when he stopped trying to fill every silence with eager communication, he created space for Sarah to experience his absence. In that absence, she began to question her earlier assessment of his value and to wonder what she might be missing. The psychological principle at work here is what modern researchers call intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful method of creating behavioral conditioning. When rewards, attention, validation, connection come unpredictably and must be worked for, they become far more powerful motivators than consistent, freely given rewards. Marcus had unknowingly been providing constant reinforcement, which paradoxically decreased his value in Sarah's mind. But the Machiavellian approach to attraction extends far beyond simple tactical withdrawal. It requires a fundamental reconstruction of one's self-concept and approach to relationships. The man who would never be destroyed by others must first destroy his own weakness, his own desperate need for validation and approval. This destruction is not about becoming callous or manipulative, but about developing genuine internal strength and options that make one's value independent of any single person's approval. Marcus began to reconstruct his life around this principle. Instead of organizing his evenings around the possibility of text conversations with women he found attractive, he filled his time with activities that genuinely interested him and that developed his skills and social connections. He began taking Brazilian jiu-jitsu classes, joined a book club focused on classical literature, and started attending networking events in his professional field. The crucial element was that these activities were genuine, not performed for the purpose of attracting women, but for the purpose of becoming a more complete and interesting person. This internal development had an unexpected external effect. As Marcus became genuinely busier and more engaged with his own life, his availability naturally decreased. When women texted him, he often didn't see the messages for hours because he was engaged in activities he found fulfilling. When he did respond, his responses were often shorter, not because he was playing games, but because he had less time and mental energy to devote to lengthy text conversations. The paradox of attraction began to reveal itself. The less available Marcus became, the more desirable he appeared to others. Women who had previously taken his immediate responses for granted began to notice and appreciate when he did engage. His responses, now less frequent and more considered, carried more weight. When he did make time for someone, it felt like a genuine choice rather than desperate availability. This transformation illustrates a crucial Machiavellian insight. True power comes not from what you do, but from what you refrain from doing. The weak self acts compulsively, responding immediately to every stimulus, making every opportunity seem like the last opportunity. The strong self acts strategically, understanding that restraint often generates more attraction than action. The concept of strategic ignoring, when properly understood and implemented, is not about cruelty or manipulation. It is about creating the psychological conditions under which genuine attraction can flourish. When someone must wonder about your availability, when they must work to capture your attention, when your time and focus become scarce resources, the natural human tendency is to assign higher value to those resources. Marcus's relationship with Sarah evolved in precisely this way. As he became less available and more selective with his attention, her interest intensified. She began initiating most of their text conversations. She would invite him to events and activities. She would seek his opinion and advice on matters she had previously handled independently. The dynamic had completely reversed, not through manipulation or games, but through Marcus's genuine transformation from a man of desperate availability to a man of selective engagement. This transformation extends beyond individual relationships to one's entire approach to social interaction. The man who has destroyed his weak, validation-seeking self becomes genuinely more attractive not just to romantic prospects, but in all social contexts. Colleagues begin to respect his opinions more when he speaks less frequently but more thoughtfully. Friends value his time more when it becomes less freely available. Social invitations increase when he becomes more selective about which invitations he accepts. The psychological mechanism underlying these changes relates to what psychologists call perceived value. In economic terms, value is often determined by scarcity relative to demand. A commodity that is freely available has low value, while a commodity that is scarce and difficult to obtain has high value. The same principle applies to human attention, time, and availability in social contexts. But Machiavelli's insight goes deeper than simple scarcity economics. He understood that human beings are fundamentally driven by the need to conquer, to achieve, to obtain that which appears difficult to attain. When Marcus made himself constantly available, he removed the element of challenge from interaction with him. There was no mountain to climb, no puzzle to solve, no conquest to achieve. His immediate availability eliminated the psychological reward that comes from earning someone's attention or affection. The weak self operates from the assumption that making things easy for others will make them more likely to choose you. This assumption is psychologically naive. Human beings are wired to value that which requires effort to obtain. The hunting instinct, the desire to pursue and capture, is deeply embedded in human psychology. When you remove all challenge from interaction with you remove one of the primary psychological drivers that creates and maintains attraction. Marcus's journey of self-destruction and reconstruction took approximately 6 months. During this period, he had to consciously resist his old patterns of immediate response and desperate availability. Each time he felt the urge to text someone immediately, to clear his schedule for a potential date, to offer unsolicited help or advice, he would pause and ask himself, is this action coming from strength or weakness? Am I acting from genuine choice or from fear of losing connection? This internal questioning became a form of meditation on his own motivations and patterns. He discovered that much of his previous behavior had been driven not by genuine care for others, but by his own fear of abandonment and rejection. When he offered immediate solutions to women's problems, he was often motivated not by altruism, but by a desperate need to prove his value. When he made himself constantly available, he was operating from the fear that any period of unavailability might result in being replaced by someone else. The process of destroying these weak patterns required considerable mental discipline. Marcus had to learn to tolerate the anxiety that came with not responding immediately, with allowing periods of silence in text conversations, with declining invitations when he had other priorities. His mind would create scenarios where his lack of immediate response would result in permanent loss of connection. Over time, however, he began to notice that the opposite occurred. When he took time to respond thoughtfully rather than immediately, his responses were generally better received. When he was selective about which invitations he accepted, the invitations he did accept seemed more meaningful and enjoyable. When he allowed natural pauses in text conversations rather than frantically trying to keep them going, the conversations often resumed more organically and with greater enthusiasm. The transformation was not merely tactical, but philosophical. Marcus began to understand that genuine attraction and respect are not created through desperate availability, but through demonstrated value, selective attention, and the maintenance of one's own priorities and standards. The Machiavellian prince maintains power not by trying to please everyone, but by being strategic about when and how to deploy his resources and attention. In romantic contexts, this philosophy translates to understanding that you cannot create desire through eager availability. Desire is created through the perception of value, scarcity, and the psychological reward that comes from earning someone's attention. When you make yourself too easy to access, when you prioritize others' schedules over your own, when you respond immediately to every communication, you signal that your time and attention have little value because they are freely given. The man who has destroyed his weak self and rebuilt himself according to Machiavellian principles operates from a fundamentally different paradigm. He understands that his time and attention are valuable resources that should be deployed strategically. He knows that saying no to good opportunities often creates space for great opportunities. He recognizes that maintaining mystery and challenge in his interactions keeps others psychologically engaged in ways that complete transparency cannot. This approach requires genuine internal development rather than superficial game playing. The tactics work because they emerge from real transformation in self-concept and life priorities. Marcus could not have successfully implemented strategic unavailability if he had not simultaneously been building a life that genuinely interested him and filled his time with meaningful activities. The scarcity of his attention was real, because his life had become genuinely full and engaging. As part 1 of this examination concludes, we see the foundation of Machiavellian attraction psychology, the understanding that human beings assign value based on scarcity, challenge, and the effort required to obtain something. The man who makes himself constantly available, who responds immediately to every communication, who bends his life around others' schedules, unwittingly signals low value and desperate need. By contrast, the man who maintains his own priorities, who is selective with his time and attention, who creates natural scarcity around his availability, generates the psychological conditions under which attraction flourishes. The journey from weak self to strong self begins with the recognition of one's own patterns of desperate availability and the conscious decision to operate from strength rather than fear. This transformation is not about becoming callous or manipulative, but about developing genuine internal resources that make one's value independent of others' approval or attention. Part 2. The psychology of power dynamics and strategic emotional distance. The second phase of Marcus's transformation involved understanding the deeper psychological mechanisms that govern human attraction and relationship dynamics. Having learned to create strategic scarcity around his availability, he now had to grapple with the more complex challenge of managing emotional investment and maintaining psychological equilibrium in the face of increasing interest from others. The Machiavellian insight that it is better to be feared than loved requires careful translation when applied to romantic relationships. In this context, it becomes, it is better to be respected than desperately needed. The fear that Machiavelli referenced was not terror, but the healthy respect that comes from understanding someone's power and boundaries. In romantic contexts, this translates to the respect that emerges when someone recognizes that you have options, standards, and the willingness to walk away if those standards are not met. Sarah's renewed interest in Marcus had created a new set of challenges. Where previously he had struggled with her lack of response, he now had to navigate her increasing availability and apparent eagerness to spend time with him. The old Marcus would have interpreted this as permission to return to his previous patterns of constant availability and eager responsiveness. The new Marcus understood that maintaining the psychological conditions that had created her renewed interest required continued strategic thinking. The concept of emotional distance does not mean coldness or cruelty. Rather, it means maintaining psychological independence while engaging in connection. Marcus learned to enjoy Sarah's company and conversation while not becoming emotionally dependent on it. He could appreciate her interest without feeling that his self-worth depended on maintaining it. This internal equilibrium allowed him to interact with her from a position of strength rather than need. This psychological stance had profound effects on their interactions. When Sarah would test his boundaries, arriving late to dates, cancelling plans at short notice, or attempting to monopolize his time, Marcus responded not with anger or desperation, but with calm consequences. If she arrived significantly late without a compelling reason, he would politely but firmly end the date early, explaining that he had other commitments. If she cancelled plans repeatedly, he would become less available for future plans, not as punishment but as natural adaptation to her demonstrated unreliability. These responses communicated several crucial messages simultaneously. First, they showed that Marcus valued his own time and expected others to do the same. Second, they demonstrated that he had options and was not desperately clinging to any single social opportunity. Third, they established that his emotional well-being was not dependent on her approval or presence. The net effect was to increase rather than decrease her respect and interest. The psychology behind these dynamics relates to what researchers call attachment theory. Individuals with secure attachment styles are comfortable with both intimacy and independence. They can connect deeply with others while maintaining their own identity and standards. This security is inherently attractive because it promises both connection and freedom, the paradoxical combination that healthy relationships require. Marcus's previous patterns had signaled anxious attachment, the desperate need for constant reassurance, the fear that any conflict or distance would result in abandonment, the willingness to sacrifice personal boundaries to maintain connection. Such patterns are inherently unattractive because they promise suffocation rather than partnership, dependence rather than mutual growth. The transformation to secure attachment required Marcus to develop what psychologists call emotional regulation, the ability to experience emotions without being controlled by them. When Sarah would not respond to his texts for several hours, he learned to notice the anxiety that arose without acting on it compulsively. Instead of sending follow-up messages or creating scenarios in his mind about why she wasn't responding, he would redirect his attention to other activities and interests. This emotional regulation was not about suppressing feelings, but about maintaining perspective and choice in how to respond to those feelings. Marcus could acknowledge that he enjoyed hearing from Sarah, while not allowing that enjoyment to become desperate need. He could appreciate her company while maintaining his own life and priorities. This internal balance created the external appearance of confidence and security that others find naturally attractive. The strategic aspect of this approach involves understanding that emotional investment should be proportional to demonstrated commitment and compatibility. The weak self invests heavily in possibilities and potential, becoming emotionally attached to people based on limited interaction and incomplete information. The strong self invests gradually and strategically, allowing emotional attachment to develop in proportion to actual shared experience and demonstrated mutual interest. Marcus began applying this principle not just with Sarah, but in all his social relationships. With new people he met, he maintained friendly but measured emotional distance until they had demonstrated through consistent actions that they were worthy of greater investment. This approach protected him from the disappointment and energy drain of investing heavily in people who were merely polite or casually friendly, not genuinely interested in deeper connection. The concept of strategic emotional distance extends to understanding the difference between being interesting and being interested. The weak self attempts to create connection by showing excessive interest in others, asking many questions, remembering every detail shared, offering unsolicited advice and support. While these behaviors seem kind and caring, they often create imbalanced dynamics where one person is doing all the emotional work while the other simply receives attention. The strong self maintains balance by being selectively interesting rather than desperately interested. Marcus learned to share his own experiences and perspectives rather than focusing exclusively on drawing out information about others. He would tell engaging stories from his own life, share his opinions on topics that came up in conversation, and demonstrate his own depth and complexity, rather than trying to solve others' problems or provide constant validation. This shift had remarkable effects on his social interactions. When Marcus stopped being the person who always asked questions and started being the person who shared interesting observations and experiences, others began working to engage him rather than simply receiving his attention. Conversations became more balanced and dynamic. People began remembering details about his life and asking follow-up questions about things he had shared. The Machiavellian principle of maintaining mystery while projecting strength applies directly to these interpersonal dynamics. Mystery is not created by being secretive or evasive, but by having a rich enough life that you cannot share everything about yourself in early interactions. When Marcus developed genuine interests, hobbies, and social connections beyond his romantic pursuits, he naturally became more mysterious because there was simply more to know about him. This mystery served multiple psychological functions. It made others curious to learn more about him. It suggested depth and complexity that could not be quickly categorized or understood. It implied that access to his full self was something that had to be earned rather than freely given. All of these factors contributed to increased attraction and respect from others. The strategic emotional distance also involved learning to be comfortable with uncertainty and incomplete information. The weak self demands constant reassurance, clear definitions of relationships, and explicit statements of interest and commitment. This demand for certainty often pushes others away because it eliminates the natural psychological tension that maintains interest and attraction. Marcus learned to be comfortable with ambiguous situations. When Sarah's level of interest seemed to fluctuate, he neither demanded clarification nor became anxious about the uncertainty. He simply continued living his life, engaging with her when she was available and responsive, and pursuing other interests when she was not. This comfort with uncertainty communicated confidence and emotional stability that made him more attractive rather than less. The psychology of intermittent reinforcement plays a crucial role in maintaining long-term attraction. When rewards come unpredictably and must be worked for, they generate more powerful emotional responses than consistent, predictable rewards. Marcus learned to apply this principle by being consistently pleasant and engaging, while varying the intensity and frequency of his attention and availability. Sometimes he would engage in long, deep conversations with Sarah. Other times he would keep interactions brief and focused. Sometimes he would initiate contact. Other times he would wait for her to reach out. This variability kept her psychologically engaged in a way that predictable behavior could not. She never knew exactly what to expect from him, which maintained her curiosity and interest. The implementation of strategic emotional distance required careful calibration. Too much distance could signal disinterest or coldness. Too little distance would recreate the patterns of desperate availability that had previously made him unattractive. Marcus had to learn to read social cues and adjust his approach based on the specific situation and relationship. With Sarah, who had previously taken his attention for granted, maintaining more distance was appropriate and effective. With other women who were naturally more reserved or less available, he could afford to show more warmth and interest without triggering the same negative dynamics. The key was understanding each person's psychology and adapting his approach accordingly while maintaining his core principles of self-respect and strategic thinking. The concept of outcome independence became crucial to maintaining strategic emotional distance. Outcome independence means engaging with situations and relationships while remaining psychologically unattached to specific results. Marcus could enjoy his interactions with Sarah, work to create positive experiences together, and invest reasonable energy in building connection while remaining emotionally prepared for any outcome, including her loss of interest or the relationship not developing as hoped. This outcome independence was not indifference or detachment, but rather confidence in his own ability to create value and find connection in multiple contexts. Because Marcus had developed a genuinely fulfilling life with multiple sources of satisfaction and self-worth, no single relationship carried the weight of his entire emotional well-being. This psychological stance paradoxically made him more attractive because it reduced the pressure on others to be responsible for his happiness. The strategic emotional distance also involved understanding the power of selective vulnerability. The weak self either shares nothing personal, appearing cold and impersonal, or shares everything immediately, appearing desperate for connection and validation. The strong self shares personal information strategically, revealing depth gradually and in response to demonstrated interest and trustworthiness. Marcus learned to calibrate his self-disclosure to match the level of investment and interest shown by others. With people who showed casual, surface-level interest, he remained friendly but general in his sharing. With those who demonstrated genuine curiosity and reciprocated with their own personal revelations, he would share more meaningful aspects of his experience and perspective. This approach created natural progression in relationships and rewarded those who invested energy in getting to know him. The maintenance of strategic emotional distance required ongoing attention to his own patterns and reactions. Marcus had to remain vigilant for signs of his old behaviors, the urge to overshare when someone showed interest, the tendency to become anxiously attached based on limited positive interaction, the inclination to prioritize others' needs and schedules over his own legitimate priorities. This self-monitoring was not neurotic self-consciousness, but strategic self-awareness. Just as a business leader monitors market conditions and adjusts strategy accordingly, Marcus learned to monitor his own psychological state and interpersonal dynamics, making adjustments as needed to maintain his position of strength and attractiveness. The effects of strategic emotional distance extended far beyond his relationship with Sarah. Marcus found that colleagues treated him with greater respect when he stopped being overly eager to help with every project and started being more selective about where he invested his professional energy. Friends valued his time more when it became less freely available. Family members began consulting him more frequently on important decisions because his advice became rarer and therefore more precious. This broad social transformation reinforced the core Machiavellian insight that power and attractiveness come from strategic resource allocation rather than generous availability. By becoming more selective about where and how he invested his time, attention, and emotional energy, Marcus increased the perceived value of these resources across all areas of his life. The strategic emotional distance also involved learning to create and maintain appropriate boundaries in all relationships. Boundaries are not walls built to keep people out, but rather guidelines that define how you expect to be treated and what kinds of behavior you will and will not accept. Clear boundaries actually facilitate deeper connection by creating safety and predictability within relationships. With Sarah, Marcus established boundaries around communication. He would not engage in long text conversations late at night. Time. He would not consistently be available on short notice. And respect. He would end interactions if she became disrespectful or dismissive. These boundaries were communicated not through lengthy discussions about relationship rules, but through consistent actions and natural consequences. When boundaries were tested, as they inevitably would be, Marcus responded with calm consistency rather than emotional reactivity. If Sarah tried to draw him into a late-night text conversation about relationship drama, he would respond briefly and kindly, then stop engaging, explaining that he preferred to discuss important matters in person when both parties were well-rested and could communicate clearly. These boundary maintenance behaviors had multiple positive effects. They communicated self-respect and emotional maturity. They created predictability that allowed others to understand how to interact with him successfully. They filtered out people who were not willing to treat him with basic respect and consideration. Most importantly, they created the psychological safety that allows genuine intimacy to develop. As part 2 of this examination concludes, we see how strategic emotional distance serves as the crucial bridge between initial attraction and sustainable relationship dynamics. The man who can maintain psychological independence while engaging in genuine connection creates the optimal conditions for both attraction and long-term compatibility. By learning to invest emotionally in proportion to demonstrated interest and commitment, by maintaining appropriate boundaries, and by staying comfortable with uncertainty and outcome independence, Marcus transformed from someone who desperately needed others' approval to someone whose approval became sought after and valued. The journey from weak self to strong self requires not just behavioral changes but fundamental shifts in self-concept and emotional regulation. The strong self operates from abundance rather than scarcity, security rather than anxiety, strategic thinking rather than compulsive reaction. These internal changes create external behaviors that others find naturally attractive and compelling. Part 3: The Mastery of Self and the Indestructible Man. The final phase of Marcus's transformation involved integrating his newfound understanding into a comprehensive philosophy of personal power and relationship mastery. Having learned to create strategic scarcity and maintain emotional distance, he now faced the ultimate challenge, becoming genuinely unshakable in the face of others' attempts to manipulate, control, or diminish him. This phase represents the full realization of Machiavelli's insight that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. The concept of the indestructible man does not refer to someone who cannot be harmed or affected by others, but rather to someone whose core identity, self-worth, and life direction remain stable regardless of external circumstances or others' opinions. This psychological fortress is built not through isolation or indifference, but through the development of internal resources so robust that external validation becomes supplementary rather than essential. Marcus's relationship with Sarah had evolved into something more serious and committed, but this progression brought new challenges that tested the foundations of his transformation. As their connection deepened, Sarah began employing various psychological tactics that his previous weak self would have found irresistible and destructive. She would withdraw affection when she wanted something, use guilt and emotional manipulation to influence his decisions, and test his boundaries through increasingly demanding behavior. The old Marcus would have responded to these tactics by increasing his efforts to please her, sacrificing his own needs and standards to restore harmony, and gradually surrendering control over his own life in exchange for her approval. The transformed Marcus recognized these patterns immediately and understood that succumbing to them would not only destroy his attractiveness but also eliminate any possibility of a healthy, balanced relationship. The Machiavellian approach to these challenges involves understanding that all relationships contain elements of power negotiation, and that those who refuse to engage strategically in these negotiations inevitably find themselves in subordinate positions. This is not about becoming manipulative or cruel, but about maintaining one's own agency and standards while navigating the complex dynamics that emerge in any significant relationship. When Sarah would withdraw affection as a means of control, Marcus would respond not with desperate attempts to win back her warmth, but with calm acceptance of her emotional state while continuing to maintain his own activities and priorities. If she chose to be cold or distant, he would remain pleasant but would not alter his behavior or sacrifice his plans to appease her mood. This response communicated that while he valued her happiness, he would not allow her emotional states to control his behavior. The psychological principle underlying this approach relates to what behaviorists call extinction, the process by which behaviors that are not reinforced gradually disappear. When Marcus stopped rewarding Sarah's manipulative behaviors with increased attention and concessions, those behaviors became less frequent and intense. She learned that withdrawal and guilt tactics would not achieve their desired effects with him, so she gradually abandoned them in favor of more direct and honest communication. Sarah initially escalated her tactics when her usual methods proved ineffective. She would become more dramatic in her emotional displays, make more extreme demands, and test his boundaries more aggressively. Marcus had to maintain consistency and calm during this escalation period, understanding that giving in to increased pressure would only teach her that more extreme tactics were necessary to influence him. The development of this unshakability required Marcus to confront and resolve his own deepest fears about relationships and abandonment. The weak self operates from the terror that any conflict, any period of tension, any expression of dissatisfaction from a partner will result in the end of the relationship. This terror makes one vulnerable to manipulation because it creates desperate willingness to do anything to avoid confrontation or disapproval. Marcus had to learn to become genuinely comfortable with the possibility that maintaining his standards and boundaries might result in the end of his relationship with Sarah. This comfort was not indifference or a desire to end the relationship, but rather the deep understanding that a relationship maintained through the sacrifice of one's integrity and self-respect is not worth having. Only when he became truly prepared to lose the relationship was he able to engage in it from a position of strength. This psychological preparation involved developing what philosophers call amor fati, love of fate, or the acceptance of whatever circumstances arise. Marcus learned to love his life and himself sufficiently that any relationship would be an addition to an already fulfilling existence rather than the foundation upon which his happiness depended. This internal abundance made him genuinely attractive and also made him invulnerable to the fear-based manipulation that controls those who operate from scarcity. The practical implementation of unshakability involved developing responses to common manipulative tactics that maintained his position while avoiding escalation into destructive conflict. When Sarah would use guilt, "If you really loved me, you would," Marcus would respond with calm acknowledgement of her feelings while maintaining his position. "I understand this is important to you, and I've given it serious consideration. My decision remains the same." When she would threaten consequences for his failure to comply with her demands, "If you don't do this, then Marcus would respond with acceptance of her right to make her own choices, while refusing to be controlled by those threats. "You have every right to make whatever decision feels right for you. I respect your autonomy and hope you'll respect mine." These responses were powerful because they refused to engage in the emotional escalation that manipulation requires to be effective. They acknowledged the other person's autonomy while firmly maintaining his own. They demonstrated strength without cruelty, firmness without aggression. Most importantly, they communicated that his decisions were based on his own values and judgment rather than fear of consequences or desperate need for approval. The mastery of this approach required Marcus to develop what might be called emotional aikido, the ability to redirect others' emotional energy rather than resisting it directly or being overwhelmed by it. When Sarah would become angry or upset about his boundaries, instead of either fighting back or capitulating, he would acknowledge her emotions while maintaining his position. "I can see this is really frustrating for you. What would help you feel better about this situation?" This approach often diffused tension because it avoided the two responses that manipulative behavior is designed to provoke: submission or counterattack. By responding with calm strength and genuine concern for her well-being while maintaining his boundaries, Marcus created space for more mature and productive communication to emerge. The development of unshakability also involved mastering the art of strategic silence. The weak self feels compelled to fill every silence, to explain every decision extensively, to justify every boundary repeatedly. This compulsive communication often weakens one's position by suggesting uncertainty or guilt. The strong self understands that some things are better communicated through behavior than words, and that excessive explanation can undermine the very boundaries one is trying to establish. When Sarah would demand extensive justification for his decisions or boundaries, Marcus learned to provide brief, clear explanations without engaging in lengthy debates. "I've decided not to change my weekend plans" was sufficient communication. Attempts to draw him into lengthy discussions about why this decision was unfair or unreasonable were met with gentle but firm redirection. "I understand you disagree with my decision. The decision stands." This approach to communication had profound effects on their relationship dynamic. Sarah began to understand that Marcus's boundaries were firm, and that attempting to debate or manipulate him out of them was ineffective. She started accepting his decisions more readily and focusing her energy on areas where negotiation and compromise were possible and appropriate. The indestructible man also masters the principle of strategic generosity. Having established his boundaries and demonstrated his unshakability, Marcus could afford to be genuinely generous and accommodating in situations where his core values and standards were not at stake. Sarah knew that his generosity came from choice rather than weakness. she valued it more highly and reciprocated more readily. When Marcus chose to be flexible about plans, helpful with problems, or accommodating of Sarah's needs, these actions carried weight precisely because she knew he was capable of saying no. His yes meant something because his no was reliable and consistent. This dynamic created a positive feedback loop, where his strategic generosity was met with appreciation and reciprocal consideration rather than taken for granted or exploited. The concept of outcome independence reached its full development in this phase of Marcus's transformation. True outcome independence is not indifference to results, but rather the confidence that one can create value and find satisfaction regardless of how specific situations develop. Marcus could invest fully in his relationship with Sarah while remaining psychologically prepared for any outcome, including its end. This outcome independence was visible in his behavior and incredibly attractive to Sarah. She could sense that he was with her by choice rather than need, that he valued their relationship while not being dependent on it for his identity or happiness. This knowledge made her feel both more secure, because his presence was genuine rather than desperate, and more motivated to maintain his interest, because she knew it was not guaranteed regardless of how she behaved. The mastery of self that Machiavelli described involves understanding that true power comes from internal strength rather than external control. The man who has destroyed his weak self no longer needs others to behave in specific ways to maintain his emotional equilibrium. He can prefer certain behaviors, work to encourage them, and set boundaries around what he will accept, but his fundamental well-being is not hostage to others' choices. This internal strength manifested in Marcus's ability to maintain his own emotional state regardless of the chaos or drama occurring around him. When Sarah would have bad days, relationship conflicts, or external stresses, Marcus could provide support and empathy without absorbing her emotional state as his own. He remained a stable, calming presence precisely because his emotional equilibrium was internally generated rather than dependent on external circumstances. The strategic implications of this emotional stability were profound. Sarah began turning to Marcus as a source of strength and guidance precisely because he did not become destabilized by her problems or emotional states. His reliability and calm strength made him more valuable to her than the previous version of himself who would have become as upset as she was, and therefore unable to provide genuine support. The indestructible man also masters the art of strategic vulnerability. Having established his strength and boundaries, he can afford to share his deeper thoughts, feelings, and experiences without fear that this information will be used against him. The vulnerability is strategic because it comes from a position of strength rather than weakness, and it deepens connection without compromising his fundamental unshakability. Marcus learned to share his fears, dreams, and uncertainties with Sarah in ways that created intimacy without dependence. He could discuss his concerns about work challenges, his hopes for their relationship's future, and his past experiences of pain and growth. This sharing was powerful because it came from someone who was clearly strong and self-possessed, rather than someone seeking validation or rescue. The integration of all these elements, strategic scarcity, emotional distance, unshakability, outcome independence, and strategic vulnerability, created what might be called integrated masculine power. This is not the toxic masculinity that demands submission from others or the weak masculinity that sacrifices everything for approval, but the mature masculinity that maintains strength while creating safety for genuine intimacy. Sarah's response to this integrated approach was everything that Marcus's previous relationships had lacked. She became more feminine in the classical sense, not weak or submissive, but gracefully receptive to his strength while contributing her own unique gifts to their partnership. She stopped testing his boundaries constantly because she trusted that they were reliable. She began supporting his goals and dreams because she knew he would support hers. Most importantly, she fell deeply in love with him precisely because he had become someone worthy of that love. The transformation was complete, not when Marcus learned to attract women, but when he became the kind of man who naturally attracted the kind of woman he wanted to be with long-term. The techniques and strategies were merely expressions of deeper character development. The real work was becoming someone whose strength, integrity, and self-possession were genuine rather than performed. The broader implications of this transformation extended far beyond romantic relationships. Marcus found that his professional life flourished as he applied the same principles of strategic thinking, boundary maintenance, and outcome independence to his career. Colleagues began respecting his opinions more when he shared them less frequently but more thoughtfully. His manager began giving him more challenging and rewarding assignments because his reliability and emotional stability made him a valuable team member. Clients preferred working with him because his confidence and expertise were evident without being arrogant or pushy. His friendships also deepened and improved as he stopped being the person who was always available for others' problems and started being the person whose company was genuinely enjoyable and enriching. Friends began reciprocating his support and investment rather than simply receiving it. Social invitations increased because his presence added value to gatherings rather than merely filling space. The Machiavellian insight that knowledge of human nature provides power proved accurate across all areas of Marcus's life. By understanding the psychological principles that govern attraction, respect, and influence, he could navigate social and professional relationships more effectively. By applying these principles with integrity rather than manipulation, he created genuine value for others while advancing his own legitimate interests. The concept of destroying the weak self and becoming indestructible proved to be not about becoming callous or isolated, but about developing such robust internal resources that external circumstances could no longer control one's emotional state or life direction. The indestructible man is actually more capable of genuine love, friendship, and service because his giving comes from abundance rather than need, strength rather than weakness. Marcus's journey from desperate availability to strategic strength illustrates the profound truth embedded in Machiavellian philosophy, that understanding and working with human nature as it actually exists, rather than as we wish it existed, provides the foundation for both personal power and genuine service to others. The man who can maintain his own center while engaging fully with life becomes a gift to everyone he encounters, precisely because his strength creates safety and his integrity creates trust. The ultimate paradox of attraction psychology is that we become most attractive to others when we no longer need their attraction to maintain our sense of self. We become most capable of love when we no longer desperately need to be loved. We become most worthy of respect when our self-respect is no longer dependent on others' opinions. This transformation from need to strength, from weakness to power, from destruction to reconstruction, represents the full realization of the Machiavellian insight into human nature and personal development. The journey is challenging because it requires abandoning patterns that feel safe and familiar, even when they are ultimately self-destructive. It demands the courage to risk losing what we have in service of gaining what we truly want. It calls for the wisdom to understand that short-term discomfort often leads to long-term fulfillment, while short-term comfort often leads to long-term dissatisfaction. But for those willing to undertake this transformation, the rewards extend far beyond improved romantic prospects. They include the deep satisfaction of living with integrity, the peace of mind that comes from outcome independence, the joy of relationships based on mutual choice rather than mutual need, and the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing that one's value is internally generated rather than externally dependent. The man who destroys his weak self and rebuilds according to Machiavellian principles does indeed become indestructible. Not because he cannot be harmed, but because his core identity and direction remain stable regardless of external circumstances. He becomes, in the deepest sense, his own man, and paradoxically, this independence makes him more valuable and attractive to others than any amount of desperate availability ever could. This is the ultimate teaching of Machiavellian attraction psychology. That true power and attractiveness come not from trying to control others or desperately seeking their approval, but from developing such robust internal strength that others naturally want to be in relationship with that strength. The journey from weakness to power is ultimately a journey from fear to love, not the desperate need that masquerades as love, but the abundant strength that makes genuine love possible.